Welcome to Tabernacle Baptist Church. We appreciate you being in God's house this morning as we're in Sunday school taking a look at Judges chapter number 16. This is a sad time in this chapter because we find that Samson, who had played with sin, and we find that description as he was looking for a wife. We find the description as he was gambling. We find that description even after 20 years of judging Israel. We find it in part of chapter 15. Chapter 16 talks about his immoral lifestyle, looking for a harlot, and how that night when they had thought that he would be surrounded, that the next day when the gates would open, they'd be able to attack him. He picked up the gates, carried them up to the top of the hill, and laid them there. We find also that as we get closer to the middle of the chapter here, that Samson fell in love with someone he shouldn't have fallen in love with. He saw Delilah, fell in love with her, and tried to woo her, but Delilah had been bought by the Philistines. They had told her that they would give her great riches if they could just get her to find out where his great strength came from. Now this gives me an idea possibly that Samson didn't look like what you would see as it's being depicted sometimes as him being a great muscular fella. He might have even been a scrawny guy with long hair. Because of the Nazarite vow, the power of the Lord comes upon him, and he does these great things, and people says, where does he get his strength from? He doesn't look like a bodybuilder. He doesn't look like he's... But this was all from the Nazarite vow that his mom had kept. And listen to this. I'm going to share this with you. Samson was not all that he could have been for the Lord, and we see his failures. But I want you to see that up until this point, we see the ministry of Samson's mom being a ministry that still echoes in Samson's life. And you can imagine Samson as he was growing up, his mom saying, now you can't cut your hair. God has called you for a special mission. God has a ministry for you. You can't cut your hair. You've got to be a Nazarite. You've got to do this. So in all of the things that are going on so far in his life that we have come to about the middle here, when he's dealing with Delilah, he has been faithful for that. So up until verse number 20 of chapter number 15, where he had judged Israel for 20 years. We have the time before that we have Chronicle. We have the time where he's dealing with Delilah here. Up until this time, 20 plus years that he had this ministry because of the faithfulness of his mother to teach that ministry. Now, let's go down here just a little bit. We'll find in verse number 7 that as Delilah says, where do you get your great strength from? That Samson tells her, bind me with 7 green withs that were never dried, then shall I be weak as another man. And at verse number 8, when the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 green withs which had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Verse number 9, now there were men lying in wait with her in the chamber, and she said unto him, the Philistines be upon thee, and Samson, be upon thee, Samson. And he brake the width, the thread of tow as broken, and it toucheth the fire. So his strength was not known. In other words, as he's dealing with now, they are in the room, in the chamber, hiding. And so when she says, Samson, the Philistines are upon thee, they jump out from wherever they were hiding. Samson knows this. Now, Samson is now, as he goes from verse number 7 to verse number 12, he's dealing with a known threat. And he is purposely placing himself in a place where he should not be. Let me stop here just a second. Many times in our Christian walk, we place ourselves in places we ought not to be. We place ourselves in places where we can be tempted to sin. Now the temptation for here Samson, knowing that Delilah was trying to find out about his strength, knowing the Philistines were in the chamber, knowing that all these things were kind of really coincidental, that he would tell her this and of course it's a lie. So why would you tell somebody a lie unless you're looking to deceive them and finding pleasure in it? Not what Samson should have been doing. He should have been dealing with truth, not deception. But once all this happened, in verse number 7 to verse number 9, then we ought to see Samson saying, I'm not going to place myself in this type of situation again. It is not wise. But, verse number 10, and Delilah said to Samson, Behold, thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Now tell me, I pray thee, wherewith thou mightest be bound. Now, here Samson is. Samson's not in a place where he could say, now Delilah, let me tell you about the Lord that I serve. This Nazarite vow that I have, the Lord that I serve, I want you to know that God loves you. You know, it'd be hard for him to witness to her because look where he is. He is playing with sin and immorality. He is playing with lying and deception. Excuse me. Verse number 11, and he said unto her, If they bind me fast with new ropes that never were occupied, then shall I be weak and be as another man. Delilah therefore took new ropes and bound him therewith, and said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And there were liars in wait in the chamber, and he brake them from off his arms like a thread. Okay, now, this is twice. This is twice. He should have known this is not a good place for me. But what he was thinking, I'm sure, is what a lot of people think today. God doesn't care what I do. Look how he's blessed me in the past. Now we're coming from it from a Christian perspective. As someone serving the Lord that has known the blessings of the Lord, and Samson has. And even though Samson has been lacking in his testimony, God had still blessed him in his work because of the Nazarite vow, because he was faithful to that vow. And again, because he was faithful to the teachings that his mom had brought to pass. Verse number 13. And Delilah said unto Samson, Hitherto thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Again, Samson has only been faithful at doing one thing, living contrary to what God would have him to live, and deceiving and lying. Tell me wherewith thou mightest be bound. And he said unto her, If thou weavest 7 locks in my head with the web. Now, again, we mentioned this last week, he's getting close to this situation where he is going to declare unto her, because he's let her put the green withs on him, he's let her put the new ropes on him. Here we find, verse number 14, and she fastened it with the pin, and said unto him, The Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awaked from his sleep, and went away with the pin of the beam, and with the web. And she said unto him, How canst thou say, I love thee? Well, it wasn't love in the first place, because love wouldn't be responsible for that type of thing. But we're talking about what Samson was dealing with here. And he's now gotten to the place where he has said, well, it has to do with my hair. But I want you to see that as he goes down to verse number 16, and she pressed him daily, verse number 17, he told her all his heart. He told him about how he'd been a Nazarite from his mother's womb, had never had his hair shaven. And even though he had touched dead things, as we find in chapter number 15, and he touched the lion that was dead to get honey out of the carcass, we find that here he says, the strength of my hair is in the fact of the Nazarite vow. And notice here, he said, if I be shaven, then my strength will go from me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. And I believe that he thought in his mind that that wouldn't be the case, that he would stretch himself, because if he had never had a haircut and Delilah shaves him and he gets up and shakes himself like he'd done in the past, thinking that he would get his strength back, and it wasn't there, he thought, well, maybe I don't need my hair. That strength is all about me. And you know that's a danger. Paul was talking about this to the church of Corinth as he spoke about the thorn in the flesh he had. When we are weak, knowing what our weaknesses are, we can be strong. Samson thought he was strong because of God's blessing and God's hand, and he became weak because he wanted to stand in his own strength. God never wants us to stand in our own strength. He wants us to stand with the strength of the Lord being a part of that. Now, notice here, she made him sleep upon her knees, and she called for a man, and she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head, and she began to afflict him, and his strength went from him. Can you imagine her starting to punch him, push him around, wake him up? So now, verse number 20, she said, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he woke of his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times before and shake myself. And he wist not that the Lord had departed from him. God is merciful, and we see that mercy even in the dealing with Samson here. God's not a God of judgment. Let me take that back. The Old Testament people have said God is a God of judgment. In the New Testament, God is a God of grace. God is a God of grace in the Old Testament and the New Testament. God is a God of mercy in the Old Testament and the New Testament. We find through the book of Psalms about the mercy of God. We find even here in the book of Judges, God's mercy. Samson could have had chastening much more quickly than he got it. But God had given him time after time, but instead of turning to the Lord, he turned away from the Lord and allowed them to cut off the locks. It was a symbol of his Nazirite vow, and God said, okay, that's it. Because God had mercy on him. God said, now it's time for chastening. Verse number 21, the Philistines took him, put out his eyes, and brought him down to Gaza, and bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. Howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. And I want you to see verse number 23 and verse number 24. We covered this last week, but I want to go back and touch base with it again. Then the lords of the Philistines gathered them together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice, for they said, our God hath delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hand. No, Dagon was a false god. He had no power over Samson. Samson, by his disobedience, had delivered himself into that. But you see what they've done. When we talk about how important it is to live for the Lord, there are people that are watching us to see if we fall, to see if there is some weakness in our armor. And aren't you glad that even when we talk about putting on the whole armor of God, there's no weakness for the Christian who wears that whole armor. But for those who fall into sin, the world says, aha, look, he fell. And they will say, their God must not be strong. Here, what the Philistine says was, our God delivered Samson into our hands. So the Philistines were able to apply a lie to what happened when we know the truth. Dagon had nothing to do with this. This was what Samson had allowed in his life that weakened his life. Verse number 24, and when the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy, and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. You can't blame the Philistines for thinking that. But you can blame Samson, who allowed them to think it because of his not doing what God had told him to do, not living the way God had chosen for him to live. It was not that Samson had no idea about how he ought to live and how he ought to behave himself. No. He had what was needed, but then he turned from the things of the Lord. How important it is that we live a Christian life, isn't that right? Because as our life is lived for the Lord, that's the power that God shows other people. And say, preacher, I'm weak. Well, God knows that. But just as God gave Samson power to do what he called him to do, God gives us the power to be faithful to him, if we'll choose to use it. And again, this is all part of a biblical doctrine. That God's not going to force his will on us, but he gives us opportunity to get saved. And he wants us to be saved. And after salvation, he gives us opportunity to be yoked with him in his will. And it's not a yoke that's forced upon us. It is a yoke we are called to put on. Jesus said, follow me and I'll make you fishers of men, when he talked to his disciples about following him. He calls us the same way. He doesn't dictate that we have to follow him, but in order for us to get the blessings, we need to follow him. He gives us the opportunity. It's interesting how people have this double standard. I've mentioned this before. On one side they say, God can't make me do anything, and that's right. God can't make you get saved if you're lost. If you're lost and you say, God can't make me get saved, you're right, God can't do that. He's offered salvation, but he doesn't make you get saved. After salvation, God can't make me live for him, you're right. Now, he probably make you wish you had lived for him. There's chastening involved, and I think this is what we're talking about. Chastening. Here, the Philistines put out his eyes, brought him down to Gaza, put him in fetters of brass. Can you imagine how hard that would have been on his skin? The damage that was done to his flesh. But now something was happening. Verse number 22, the little hint. Howbeit the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. Here we go. An opportunity that's starting to bud. And chastening may be hard, and this is pretty hard chastening. He was placed in fetters, placed in a prison, forced to grind. Was it a big, and you get pictures of this big stone, and he's pushing that stone around. I don't know what it was like for him to do the grinding in prison. But here was a man that had known great possibilities, that had lost everything. Now the possibilities that he faced, that he lost, was the possibility of being able to declare how good God is. Instead, we have Delilah testifying that he lied to them. And we could go back to the time where it's testified in the scripture, where he touched the dead carcass of a lion to get honey. And without telling his mom and dad, because they would have been upset, giving that honey to them. And also chapter 15, where he picked up the jawbone of an ass to slay these 1,000 men. But what we find here is that God in his mercy has given him victory over and over, but there was a time that he crossed the line and he said, that's it. And if you had, I don't know, I can't remember my mom and dad ever saying, one more time and you'll get it. I think I remember getting it. I don't remember being warned, one more time and you'll get it. But how many times that the Lord prompted him to remind him that he was good? Now, verse number 25, it came to pass when their hearts were merry that they said, call for Samson, that he may make us sport. And they called for Samson out of the prison house, and he made them sport, and they set him between the pillars. Now, go back to verse number 22. This is not a couple of weeks. This may not have been months. This may have been years in the making. That Samson was in a place of chastening. No sight. The pain that he had from the brass fetters that he was wearing, the chores that he did in grinding at the millstone, and just this idea that he was now helpless. And even though his hair was starting to grow back, nobody thought, now that he was blind, now that he was a prisoner, everybody thought he's a has-been. He's not good for anything. And we want to be careful that we don't ever get to that place. You understand? We don't want to get to the place where the world sees what we have done and says, well, that's it for them. There's nothing they can do now. Now you know that that's not true. That where there's repentance and there's confessing of sin, God can still use a person. But you have to realize, just as David had the fling with Bathsheba, and it cost him his baby son, it cost him 2 other sons that he had. And for a while it cost him the kingdom as he had to run in fear. All of that because of what had happened in him taking the step. When he met with Nathan, the one that said, thou art the man, to David, when David said, we need to bring judgment to this one who'd stolen a lamb out of another man's house, and Nathan said, thou art the man. When David said, oh, I've sinned, I've got to have forgiveness. Nathan said, God has already forgiven you, but there's still consequences to sin. And here, as we're seeing, we're not told about what was thought during that time, but you can imagine that there was a humility that was brought upon Samson, because now he was not in the power of his place that God had given him. He was in the weakness of his place that he placed himself. Notice the end of verse number 25, chapter 16. And he made them sport, and they set him between the pillars. Now, verse number 26. Have you ever been in a place where you felt like you couldn't serve God, and all of a sudden it seemed like there's something handed right in your hand? He's placed between the pillars. And Samson, verse number 26, said unto the lad that held him by the hand, suffer me that I may feel the pillars whereupon the house standeth, that I may lean upon them. He's telling this boy, take me to the pillars that hold up this place. Well, he was between the pillars. But notice here, they thought he was so harmless that a lad could lead him around by the hand. They had no fear of Samson now. There was no fear because of what he could do. He had failed. And they had mistakenly thought it was the power of Dagon that had given the victory to them. But we're going to see that Samson is going to be brought back into a place where he can serve the Lord. Were there consequences? Yes. Were there problems that Samson would face? Yes. But there was also opportunity. Now, the question is, what would have been better in the long run? Wouldn't it have been better if Samson had kept his sight and had kept his strength and had kept his purity so he could serve the Lord? Wouldn't that have been far better? Because this is going to be something great that's going to happen here. And let me read on. I'd like to go just a little bit further, verse number 27, now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there, and there were upon the roof about 3,000 men and women that beheld Samson and made sport. And Samson called unto the Lord and said, now I just want to, he's leaning against the pillars that are holding up this whole building. Thousands of leaders were there. Thousands of those that had social priority were there. All the bigwigs of the Philistines, they were gathered there to make fun of Samson, thinking their god, their false god Dagon, had brought a victory. And can you imagine in all of this, that while the festivities were going on and there was a laughter and a drunkenness, that they hear this voice, I'm sure being announced as clear as a bell, not necessarily because Samson was speaking, but because God was amplifying what Samson was saying. He said, O Lord, remember me, I pray thee, and strengthen me, I pray thee, only this once, O God, that I may be at once avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars from which the house stood, and on it was the borne up of the one with his right hand, the other with his left. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he bowed himself with all his might. And the house fell upon the lords and upon the people that were therein. So the dead which he slew in his death were more than they which he slew in his life. But there's a problem with that. You know what the problem is? You know what the problem is? Samson couldn't do anything else for God. His ministry was over with this one act. It could have been a ministry that would have stretched through the time that his eyes were out and his head was shaven. Could have been a ministry. Months, maybe years. There could have been a ministry there. There wasn't. Could have been a ministry after this time had Samson not been in the chastening of the Lord. Had Samson not been, and you say, but preacher, he did the will of God. Yes. I understand that God did use Samson. He gave his strength back. One more act, a mighty act that Samson did, a sacrificial act. Here was Samson worshiping God. Here was Samson not thinking of himself. He said, avenge me for my 2 eyes. But he did it because it needed to be done. Notice verse number 31. And his brethren and all the house of his father came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Estiol in the burying place of Manoah his father. And he judged Israel for 20 years. He judged Israel. He did. Everybody knows about Samson, but then they also know about Delilah too, don't they? They know about Samson, they know about Delilah. But the opportunity that Samson had to avoid the immorality, the opportunity that Samson had to continue his ministry for the Lord, he could have gone more than just 20 years, but he didn't. We find, as we take a look at this, that Samson died, and the epitaph said, he slew more at his death, more than they which he slew in his life. Oh, what an opportunity we have to be able to share not only the goodness of God, but to have the opportunity to be a testimony for the Lord. Samson could have been faithful to death instead of being faithful in death. Good opportunity for us to remember that, and we'll stop there just before going to chapter 17. Lord willing, we'll take a look at chapter number 17 next week.